For 57 years, a Jewish photographer from Los Angeles stared at the face of a crucified man he was never supposed to believe in. His name was Barrie Schwortz. He did not go to church. He did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. He grew up reading the Torah, not the Gospels. And yet, for more than half a century, he spent nearly every waking hour studying a single piece of yellowed linen, a 14-foot strip of ancient cloth that some say wrapped the body of Christ himself. You've probably seen it before. It looks like an old stained sheet. A faint outline, a blurry shape that could almost be a man, or could be nothing at all. Most people glance at it and move on. But the Shroud of Turin has never been just another religious relic. For centuries, people have claimed to see things in it that should not be there. Blood that bled the wrong way. Wounds too anatomically perfect for any medieval forger to invent. A face that only fully appears in photographic negative. Pollen from a land thousands of miles from where the cloth supposedly came. And buried deeper still, hidden in the cloth's tortured fibres, something Schwortz refused to discuss publicly for decades. One small detail, one tiny anomaly he caught on his own film in 1978. Something that, by his own admission, terrified him every time he looked at it. This is the story of that detail. And before we get to what he saw, you need to understand what he was looking at. Walk into the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. And most days, you would not even see it. The shroud is kept locked in a silver casket, behind a bulletproof case, beneath a chapel that took decades to restore after a fire nearly destroyed it in 1997. It is shown to the public only a handful of times each century. When it does appear, it stretches more than 14 feet long and around 3.5 feet wide. A single, herringbone-woven piece of linen, the kind of weave used in the ancient Near East. On its surface lies the faint, sepia-toned image of a man. He appears twice, once from the front, once from the back, as though the cloth had been laid beneath him and then folded over his head to cover his body, exactly as Jewish burial customs of the 1st century would have required. The man is naked, his hands are crossed over his groin, his wrists, not his palms, are pierced, his side bears a wound, his scalp is dotted with dozens of puncture marks consistent with a crown of thorns. His back and legs are covered in over 120 lacerations. Wounds matching a Roman flagrum, a whip with metal-tipped tails used during the time of Christ. For centuries, the Catholic Church has refused to officially declare what the shroud is. They call it an icon, a symbol, a devotional object. They do not say it is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, but they also have never said it isn't. And that ambiguity is the first crack in the door. Because the moment science was finally allowed to examine the shroud up close, in October of 1978, the questions stopped being theological. They became physical. And no one, not the believers, not the skeptics, and certainly not Barrie Schwortz, was prepared for what they would find. For most of history, relics were easy to debunk. Splinters of the true cross, vials of blood, sacred bones. Almost all of them collapsed under scrutiny. Medieval Europe was flooded with fakes, and by the 19th century, skeptics had become very good at spotting them. So when the Shroud of Turin first appeared in the historical record, in the 1350s, in the small French town of Lire, the church responded the way it usually did, with suspicion. The local bishop wrote a letter to the Pope claiming an artist had confessed to painting it. Case closed. Except it wasn't. The shroud kept defying every explanation thrown at it. It survived a fire in 1532 that should have destroyed it. It survived another fire in 1997. It survived centuries of folding, handling, and exposure. And the strangest thing, the longer scientists looked at it, the less it behaved like a painting. In 1898, a man named Secondo Pia was given permission to photograph the shroud for the first time. When he developed his glass plate in his darkroom that night, he nearly dropped it, because what he saw on the negative was not a negative at all. It was a positive photograph. The faint, blurry image on the cloth, when reversed, turned into a hauntingly detailed portrait of a man. A real face. Eyes, nose, beard, bruising, bleeding. Whoever made the shroud had somehow encoded a photographic negative onto a piece of linen 500 years before photography was invented. That single discovery turned the shroud from a curiosity into one of the most studied objects in human history. Scientists, artists, doctors, chemists and military researchers all began lining up to examine it. But not all of them were welcomed. The Vatican was extremely careful about who got close. It would take 80 more years before a full scientific team was finally granted access to the cloth itself. That team was called STURP, and on its roster of 33 scientists, the only Jewish member was a quiet documentary photographer from California who had come along just to do his job. He had no idea his life was about to change forever. The Shroud of Turin research project was assembled in 1977. It was made up of 33 specialists: physicists, biophysicists, chemists, forensic pathologists, image analysts and imaging experts from Los Alamos National Laboratory, the same lab that had designed the atomic bomb. Their mission was simple: examine the cloth, determine what made the image, settle the matter once and for all. Barrie Schwortz was brought on as the team's official documenting photographer. He almost turned down the assignment. He had no interest in Christianity. He thought the whole thing was probably a medieval painting, and he expected the trip to Turin to be a paid vacation that ended in a polite scientific shrug. When asked years later why he stayed on the project after that first encounter, Schwartz gave an answer that has haunted Shroud researchers ever since. He said the moment he saw the cloth in person, something was wrong. Not wrong in a religious sense, wrong in a scientific sense. The image, he said, did not behave the way an image should behave. It had no brush strokes, no pigment build-up, no directionality. There was no outline, no underdrawing, no edges where one colour stopped and another began. The colour of the image was not on the threads. It was on the very top fibrils of the threads, each fibril only a few microns thick, as though the image had been laid onto the cloth in a single, impossibly precise instant, by something that touched only the highest points of the surface. Paint sinks, dye soaks, ink bleeds. The Shroud image did none of those things. For 5 days in October 1978, the STURP team ran every test they were allowed to run. They used X-ray fluorescence, ultraviolet light, infrared photography, microscopy, spectroscopy, and adhesive tape lifts to sample the surface fibres. They photographed every inch of the cloth in extreme detail. They expected to find pigment, they expected to find dye, they expected to find something, anything, that could be catalogued and labelled and dismissed. They found none of it, and the more Schwartz looked at his own photographs in the months that followed, the more he started to notice something no one else on the team had said out loud. Before we get to what Schwartz saw, we need to talk about the body on the cloth, because the body itself is its own argument. The man in the shroud is roughly 5 feet 11 inches tall. He weighs around 175 pounds. He has long hair, a beard and a face, with what appears to be Semitic features. His estimated age is somewhere between 30 and 35. He has been crucified, but not in the way artists have depicted crucifixion for the last 1,500 years. Look at almost any Renaissance painting of Christ on the cross. The nails go through his palms. That image is so ingrained in Western culture that it has become the visual shorthand for the crucifixion itself. But anatomically, it is impossible. Palms cannot support the weight of a hanging human body. The flesh between the bones simply tears. The man on the shroud was nailed through the wrists, specifically through a tiny gap in the wrist bones now called destot space, a fact that was not understood by medical science until the 20th century. A forger working in the Middle Ages could not have known this. And there is another detail. When a nail is driven through destot space, it severs the median nerve. The thumb of the victim contracts inward against the palm and remains there until death. Look at the hands on the shroud. The thumbs are not visible. They are tucked inward, exactly where a severed median nerve would force them. The man's side bears a wound roughly 4 centimetres wide and 1.5 centimetres tall, the shape of a Roman lancea, the spear tip carried by Roman legionaries in the 1st century. From that wound, 2 distinct streams flow, one thick and dark, one thin and clear. Forensic pathologists examining the cloth identified the dark stream as blood and the clear stream as pleural fluid, exactly what would have separated in the chest cavity of a man who had been dead on a cross for several hours. Across the man's back, more than 120 dumbbell-shaped wounds in a sweeping pattern indicate he was scourged by 2 Roman soldiers, one taller than the other, standing on either side of him. The instrument used was almost certainly a flagrum taxillatum, a whip with small lead or bone weights at the end of each cord. This is not the work of a medieval artist. This is forensic science. And it is just the beginning. Now look closer, because the blood is its own mystery. In the 1980s, two members of the STURP team, Dr. John Heller and Dr. Alan Adler, examined the red marks on the shroud with extreme care. They used microspectrophotometry, chemical tests, and forensic blood analysis. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The red stains were not paint, not iron oxide, not pigment of any kind. They were real human blood. Type AB mixed with serum. With high levels of bilirubin, the chemical the human body releases under extreme stress and trauma. But the more disturbing detail was this: the blood was on the cloth before the image was. Under microscopic examination, the image fibers stop at the edges of the bloodstains. They never appear underneath the blood, which means whatever process created the image happened after the body had already bled onto the linen. If a forger had painted the figure first, the pigment would lie beneath the blood. It does not. The blood came first, the image came second. And there is the matter of how the blood actually flowed. A forger painting a crucified body would have painted gravity-fed bloodstreams as a viewer sees them, straight down. But the blood on the shroud flows in patterns that match a body hanging on a cross at an angle, with arms outstretched above the head. The blood on the wrists runs along the forearm. The blood on the feet pools where the nail entered. The blood on the side runs sideways across the lower back, exactly as it would if the body were laid flat after death. These are not the marks a painter would invent. They are the marks a corpse would leave. Schwortz noticed all of this. He admitted in interview after interview that as a Jewish man with no theological investment in the figure on the cloth, he had no reason to defend its authenticity. He simply could not find a way to explain it away. But the wounds and the blood were not the detail that terrified him. The detail that terrified him was something he saw later, something hidden in the image itself. In 1976, 2 years before STURP arrived in Turin, two Air Force researchers named John Jackson and Eric Jumper made a discovery that would change everything. They had a machine called the VP8 Image Analyzer. It was originally built to interpret photographs taken by spacecraft, specifically images returned from the surface of Mars. The VP8 worked by reading the brightness of every pixel in a photograph and translating that brightness into spatial depth. Bright spots became hills, dark spots became valleys. The result was a three-dimensional terrain map of whatever the photograph showed. When Jackson and Jumper ran a photograph of the shroud through the VP8, the machine did not show a flat image. It showed a fully three-dimensional, anatomically accurate human body. Rising up off the screen, a face with depth, a nose with a ridge, cheekbones, eye sockets, a jawline, a torso, limbs, all in proper proportion. This had never happened before. It has not happened since. Every other photograph or painting ever tested in a VP8 produces a distorted, useless result. Flat areas read as the same depth. Shadowed areas read as deep wells. Faces become mountains and pits with no relationship to reality. Only the shroud produces a real body. This means the image on the shroud encodes depth information. The intensity of the image at any given point on the cloth corresponds directly to the distance between the cloth and the body that was beneath it. Where the cloth touched the skin, the image is darkest. Where the cloth was farther from the skin, over the curve of the cheekbone, the i.e. tip of the eye socket, the image is lighter. Mathematically, point for point, the image is a topographic map of a human form. No painting works this way. No photograph works this way. No print, no rubbing, no scorch, no chemical reaction known to science works this way. A medieval forger could not have done it. He would have had no reason to even try. The very concept of encoding spatial depth into brightness values would not be invented for another 600 years, with the rise of digital imaging. And yet there it is, on a piece of 1st century linen. Schwortz, when he first saw the VP8 results, did not say a word for several minutes. He was a photographer. He understood images. He understood what it meant for an image to contain depth information that a flat surface should not be able to hold. Something, he later said, had created this image from the inside out, not painted onto the cloth, radiated through it. In 1988, Just 10 years after STURP completed its work, the Vatican authorized the most controversial test ever performed on the shroud: carbon dating. 3 laboratories, in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson, were given small samples cut from a single corner of the cloth. They were asked to determine its age. Their results came back almost identical. The cloth, they concluded, dated to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. It was, the headlines screamed, a medieval forgery. For the church, it was a disaster. For skeptics, it was vindication. For Schwortz, who had spent a decade arguing for the shroud's authenticity to a scientific community that increasingly mocked him, it was the lowest moment of his career. He almost walked away. But then, slowly, a problem began to surface. Researchers studying the carbon dating sample noticed something odd. The corner the sample had been taken from, known as the rise corner, was not consistent with the rest of the cloth. It contained cotton fibres, which appear nowhere else on the shroud. It showed traces of dye. It was thicker. It was structured differently. And under chemical analysis, it appeared to be a section of invisible reweaving, a medieval textile repair technique used to mend damaged cloth by hand-stitching new threads into the original weave. In 2005, chemist Raymond Rogers, one of the original STURP scientists, published a study showing that the carbon-dated sample contained material chemically distinct from the rest of the shroud. His conclusion was devastating. The laboratories had not dated the shroud. They had dated a medieval patch sewn into the shroud. A 2019 reanalysis of the raw carbon dating data, released after years of legal battles to obtain it, showed wild statistical inconsistencies between the 3 labs' results, inconsistencies that should have invalidated the test under the lab's own published standards. The carbon dating, in other words, had collapsed. But the damage to the public perception was already done. Most people who heard about the shroud in the late 1980s heard it was a fake. Most of them never heard the follow-up. Schwortz spent the next 30 years trying to correct the record, lecturing, publishing, building archives, speaking to anyone who would listen. And the entire time, he carried with him the single detail that had unnerved him most. So how was the image made? Over the last 50 years, every major scientific theory has been tested. None of them work. Painted forgery, rejected, no pigment on the image fibres. Scorch from a hot statue, rejected. Scorches fluoresce under ultraviolet light, the shroud does not. A medieval photograph created by Leonardo da Vinci using a camera obscura and silver salts, rejected. The shroud predates him by at least a century. There is no silver in the image, and the chemistry required would not be invented for 400 years after his death. A bas-relief rubbing, rejected. Neither it nor a hot metal contact print encodes 3D depth. A natural chemical reaction between body gases and the cloth, partially possible for surface coloration, but it does not explain the depth encoding or the photographic clarity. There is only one theory that mathematically accounts for everything: a burst of intense radiation from inside the body itself. In 2011, scientists at Italy's ENEA Research Centre attempted to recreate the image using an ultraviolet excimer laser. After years of experiments, they were able to produce, on a small patch of linen, a coloration nearly identical to the ET shrouds. The total power required, they calculated, to recreate the full image on the entire cloth would be roughly 34 trillion watts of vacuum ultraviolet radiation, delivered instantaneously from inside the body. Nothing on Earth, the lead researcher admitted, could currently produce that. So how was it made? That is the question Schwortz could not answer. And it is not the detail that terrified him. Before we go further, we have to slow down, because not everyone is convinced, and the skeptical case deserves to be heard. In 1980, microscopist Walter McCrone announced that he had found particles of iron oxide and vermilion pigment on the tape samples taken from the shroud during the STURP investigation. To him, this proved the image was painted. The rest of the team disagreed sharply, arguing that the pigment particles McCrone found were minor surface contamination, likely from medieval artists laying their own painted copies on top of the original to sanctify them through contact. Hundreds of such copies were made between the 14th and 17th centuries, and many were rubbed directly against the relic. Other skeptics point out that the historical record of the shroud before 1350 is essentially blank. If it really is the burial cloth of Jesus, Where was it for the 1,300 years between his death and its appearance in Lyre? Believers point to references to a similar cloth called the image of Edessa, venerated in Constantinople until the city was sacked by Crusaders in 1204. Skeptics say the connection is speculative. There is also the simple fact that the Church itself has never officially declared the shroud authentic. If the Vatican itself will not commit, the skeptics argue, why should anyone else? These are real arguments. They deserve respect. The shroud has not been proven. It will likely never be proven. The most scientifically rigorous statement anyone can make about it is this: we do not know what it is. We do not know how it was made. We do not know who is on it. But Schwortz, the Jewish photographer who came expecting to debunk it all, had seen something on his own film, and he had carried it with him for 57 years. It is time to tell you what it was. The detail was this: when Schwortz developed his ultra-high-resolution photographs of the shroud in his California darkroom, in late 1978, he began studying the image of the face, just the face. He examined it with magnifiers, then with microscopes, then with image enhancement equipment normally used to analyse military reconnaissance photographs. And on the eyelids of the man on the shroud, he saw them, two small, round, raised impressions, one over each eye, roughly the size of a small coin, with faint curved markings along their edges. He brought them to the attention of other researchers. They were studied most famously by Father Francis Felix, a Jesuit at Loyola University, who claimed to have identified the markings as letters, specifically the Greek letters UCAI, arranged in a curved pattern around what looked like an astronomical instrument called a lituus. Felix matched the markings to a known coin of the 1st century, a small bronze coin called a lepton, minted in Judea during the reign of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. Between roughly 29 and 32 AD, the coin bore the lituus, and around it, a misspelled Greek inscription reading Tibepioi Kaikapok, of Tiberius Caesar. The exact misspelling, including an unusual letter substitution, matched a known variant of the Pilate lepton that was only minted for a brief window of time during the reign of Tiberius, a window that ended in the year 32 AD. Schwortz, who did not believe in Jesus, who did not accept the resurrection, who had spent his life as a documentary photographer, trained to look at evidence and only evidence, sat in his darkroom and stared at the impression of a Roman coin minted during the lifetime of Pontius Pilate, resting on the eyelid of a crucified man whose burial cloth he had been told was a medieval forgery. It was an ancient Jewish burial custom to place coins on the eyes of the dead. The custom had largely been forgotten by the Middle Ages. No forger in 1300 would have known to include it. No painter would have rendered it so faintly that it required 20th century photographic enhancement to see. No medieval artist had access to a coin that had not circulated in over 1,000 years. The coin on the right eye had been minted in Jerusalem by Pontius Pilate, sometime between 29 and 32 AD, the exact range of years that bracket the most likely date of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Schwortz never converted. He remained until the end a Jewish man who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah, but he spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that whatever the Shroud of Turin is, it is not a medieval painting. It is something else, something he could not name. Something that, in his own words, every time he looked at the photographs he had taken with his own hands in 1978, made the hair on his arm stand up. A coin, minted by the man who ordered Jesus crucified, resting on the eye of the man in the cloth. That was the detail, and 57 years later, he still could not explain it.